If your mind feels restless even when your body is tired, this story is for you. Arthur Schopenhauer spent his entire life studying the hidden forces that keep humans awake, dissatisfied, and endlessly wanting. This documentary is not meant to excite you. It is meant to explain why rest feels so difficult and how understanding alone can begin to calm a mind. The story of Arthur Schopenhauer is the story of a man who looked directly at suffering and refused to look away. To understand him, it is not enough to list his ideas or summarize his books. His philosophy grew slowly from his temperament, his early experiences, and his deep dissatisfaction with the promises of happiness that society offered. Arthur Schopenhauer was born in 1788 in the port city of Danzig. From the beginning, his life was marked by movement and uncertainty. His father was a successful merchant who believed strongly in independence, discipline, and self-control. He wanted his son to become practical, resilient, and capable of surviving in a competitive world. His mother was intellectual, socially ambitious, and deeply invested in literary culture. Their marriage was tense, and the emotional atmosphere of the home was unstable. As a child, Schopenhauer traveled widely across Europe. He saw wealth and poverty side by side. He observed how people pursued success, pleasure, and recognition with intensity, yet rarely appeared satisfied. These early observations planted a seed that would later grow into one of his central convictions: that human desire is endless, and that satisfaction is always temporary. His relationship with his father was difficult. Expectations were heavy, and affection was limited. Schopenhauer felt that he was being shaped for a life that did not belong to him. When his father died under circumstances that strongly suggest suicide, the event left a permanent impression. It confirmed for Schopenhauer that despair was not a weakness of character, but something woven into human existence itself. After his father's death, Schopenhauer turned fully toward education and philosophy. He studied at several universities and immersed himself in the works of earlier thinkers. The most important influence during this period was Immanuel Kant. Kant had argued that the world we experience is shaped by the mind, that we do not see reality directly, but through mental structures that organize perception. Schopenhauer accepted this insight, but he felt it was incomplete. Kant explained how we experience the world, but not why it feels so restless and painful. Schopenhauer believed there was something deeper operating beneath appearances, something more fundamental than reason. This idea began to take shape as he worked on his first major book, The World as Will and Representation. This work would become the foundation of his philosophy. In it, Schopenhauer proposed that the world has two sides. The world as representation is the world as it appears to us. The world as will is the underlying force that drives all living things. The will, in Schopenhauer's view, is not conscious or rational. It is a blind striving. It pushes plants to grow, animals to survive, and humans to desire. It is the reason people seek pleasure, power, love, and meaning. And it is also the reason they suffer. Schopenhauer argued that because the will never rests, satisfaction is always short-lived. When a desire is fulfilled, boredom follows. When a desire is not fulfilled, suffering follows. Life becomes an endless movement between lack and dissatisfaction. This is not because individuals fail, but because the structure of existence itself is restless. What makes this idea powerful is that Schopenhauer did not present it as a moral judgment. He did not accuse people of being weak or foolish. He described a condition, a pattern he believed could be observed everywhere once one looked honestly. In this first major work, Schopenhauer also explored the role of art. He believed that art offers temporary relief from the will. When a person becomes deeply absorbed in music, painting, or literature, the constant pressure of desire briefly fades. For a moment, one becomes a pure observer rather than a striving individual. Music, in particular, held a special place in his philosophy. He believed it expressed the will directly, without concepts or images. At the time of its publication, The world as will and representation was largely ignored. Schopenhauer had hoped it would establish his reputation. Instead, it passed almost unnoticed. This rejection deeply affected him. He felt misunderstood and sidelined by the academic world. Yet rather than softening his views, this experience hardened them. Schopenhauer grew increasingly convinced that society preferred comforting illusions over uncomfortable truths. He withdrew from academic life and lived in relative isolation. This withdrawal was not peaceful. It was marked by resentment, pride, and a deep sense of being ahead of his time. It was also during this period that his philosophy matured. Free from a need to please institutions or audiences, he continued refining his ideas. He expanded his thinking beyond metaphysics into ethics, aesthetics, and human psychology. At the end of this first phase of his life and thought, Schopenhauer stands as a solitary figure, convinced that suffering is fundamental to life, certain that desire governs human behavior more than reason, and committed to articulating these ideas clearly, even if they were unwelcome. The foundation has been laid. From here, Schopenhauer philosophy would grow darker, more precise, and more influential than he could have imagined. As Schopenhauer moved deeper into adulthood, his philosophy became more precise and his isolation more pronounced. The ideas he had formed were no longer only personal convictions. They had become a complete worldview, and he felt compelled to defend it with clarity and force. Yet the world around him remained largely indifferent. This contrast between inner certainty and outer neglect shaped the next long phase of his life. After the publication of The World as Will and Representation, Schopenhauer attempted to enter academic life. He sought a position as a university lecturer, believing that philosophy should confront students directly with uncomfortable truths. He deliberately scheduled his lectures at the same time as those of George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, the most influential philosopher of the time. Hegel represented everything Schopenhauer opposed: optimism, abstraction, faith in historical progress, and a belief that reason ultimately governed reality. The result was disastrous for Schopenhauer. Students did not attend his lectures. They were drawn instead to Hegel's system and reputation. This rejection was humiliating and deeply embittering. Schopenhauer concluded that academic philosophy rewarded conformity rather than insight. He abandoned teaching altogether and withdrew from institutional life. This withdrawal allowed him to observe human behavior more closely. He lived alone, read extensively, and reflected on everyday interactions with unusual sharpness. His philosophy turned increasingly toward ethics and the nature of human conduct. He asked a simple but unsettling question: if suffering is fundamental to life, how should one live? Schopenhauer's answer was not rebellion or indulgence. It was restraint. He argued that most human misery comes from desire. Desire for wealth, status, recognition, love, and control. These desires arise from the will, and the will is never satisfied. Therefore, a wise life does not seek to fulfill desire endlessly, but to quiet it. These ideas found fuller expression in his later writings. One of the most important was on the basis of morality. In this work, Schopenhauer rejected moral systems based on duty or abstract rules. He argued that true morality arises from compassion. When one recognizes that others suffer in the same way one does, a natural ethical response emerges. This compassion was not sentimental. It did not depend on optimism about human nature. It arose from the recognition that all individuals are manifestations of the same underlying will. In harming others, one harms oneself at a deeper level. In easing suffering, one briefly resists the blind force that governs life. Another important work from this period was the two fundamental problems of ethics. Here, Schopenhauer examined freedom and responsibility. He argued that human actions are not free in the way people believe. Character is shaped by temperament, circumstance, and unconscious drives. People act as they must, not as they choose. Responsibility, therefore, must be understood differently. Judgment should give way to understanding. Schopenhauer's writing style during this period became sharper and more direct. He abandoned complex systems in favor of clear language and concrete examples. He believed that philosophy should illuminate life, not obscure it. His disdain for fashionable ideas and empty language grew stronger. One of his most widely read works emerged later, titled Parerga and Paralipomena. Unlike his earlier dense writings, this book consisted of essays and aphorisms. It addressed everyday topics such as happiness, suffering, success, and human behavior. In this work, Schopenhauer spoke directly to the reader, offering observations drawn from a lifetime of reflection. In these essays, Schopenhauer explained why happiness should not be pursued as a primary goal. He argued that happiness is best understood as the absence of pain rather than the presence of pleasure. Pleasure fades quickly, but suffering lingers. A calm, modest life with limited desire offers more stability than one driven by ambition. He also wrote extensively about solitude. Schopenhauer believed that solitude was not a punishment, but a privilege for those capable of thought. He argued that many people seek constant company not out of joy, but out of an inability to be alone with their own minds. For Schopenhauer, solitude allowed clarity and freedom from social pressure. At the same time, his writing reveals a deep skepticism about romantic love. He believed that what people call love is often the will expressing itself through biology. Desire disguises itself as meaning. Individuals believe they are choosing freely, when in reality they're being driven by forces beyond awareness. These views were controversial and often misunderstood. Schopenhauer was labeled pessimistic, cynical, and misanthropic. Yet his writing suggests something more restrained. He did not hate humanity. He distrusted illusions. He believed that false hope caused more harm than honest understanding. For many years, Schopenhauer remained largely ignored. His books sold slowly. His ideas circulated quietly. He lived simply, accompanied mostly by books and his dog. Yet he did not doubt the truth of his philosophy. He believed recognition would come later, if it came at all. As he grew older, the world slowly began to change around him. New generations of readers, less committed to optimistic systems, began to find his writing compelling. The culture was becoming more receptive to his clarity and honesty. Schopenhauer stood firm, unchanged in his convictions. His philosophy had reached maturity. What remained was for the world to catch up. By the time Arthur Schopenhauer reached the middle of his life, his philosophy had hardened into something unshakable. It was no longer a collection of insights or reactions. It was a complete vision of existence, refined through decades of reading, isolation, disappointment, and observation. Everything he wrote from this point forward deepened and clarified the same central truth he believed he had discovered early on. The foundation of his thought remained the same. The world has two sides. One is how it appears to us. The other is what it truly is beneath appearances. Schopenhauer explained this distinction carefully in The World as will and representation. The world we experience through our senses is representation. It exists only as it appears to a perceiving subject. Space-time, causality, objects, identity. All of these are structures of a human mind. They shape how the world looks to us, but do not reveal what the world is in itself. Behind this surface lies the will. The will is not conscious thought. It is not intention. It is not moral or immoral. It is a blind, striving force. It pushes without knowing why. It does not aim at happiness. It does not aim at progress. It only aims to continue. Schopenhauer believed that everything living is an expression of this will. Plants grow toward light without understanding. Animals hunt and reproduce without reflection. Humans desire endlessly while inventing reasons for those desires. Reason does not control the will. Reason serves it. This explains why human beings feel permanently restless. Even when external needs are met, dissatisfaction returns. The will does not stop when a goal is achieved. It simply changes direction. Schopenhauer described life as a cycle. Desire creates suffering. Fulfillment creates boredom. Boredom generates new desire. The cycle repeats until death. This is not a metaphor. It is a structural feature of existence. From this understanding, Schopenhauer redefined happiness. He argued that happiness is not something positive that can be accumulated. It is only the temporary absence of pain. Pleasure fades quickly because it merely removes a lack. Once the lack is gone, nothing remains. This is why Schopenhauer believed modern societies misunderstand happiness. They encourage people to chase pleasure intensity, success recognition. But these pursuits strengthen the will rather than calming it. The result is anxiety, exhaustion, envy, and disappointment. True wisdom for Schopenhauer lies in reducing desire. Lower expectations, fewer attachments, emotional restraint. A simple life does not promise joy. It offers quiet. This view extended into his analysis of love and sexuality. Schopenhauer devoted significant attention to this topic because he believed it revealed the will in its most deceptive form. Romantic love feels personal, meaningful, unique. Yet Schopenhauer argued it is one of the strongest tricks of the will. Individuals believe they are choosing freely. In reality, they're being used by the species to reproduce. Attraction appears irrational because it is not designed for individual well-being. It serves life continuation. This explains why love can overpower reason, destroy stability, and cause immense suffering. It is not an error. It is the will acting directly through biology and emotion. Schopenhauer, writing on love, shocked many readers because of its bluntness. Yet his aim was not cruelty. It was clarity. He believed illusions are more harmful than uncomfortable truth. As his thinking matured, Schopenhauer turned increasingly toward ethics. His ethical works rejected traditional moral philosophy almost entirely. And on the basis of morality, he argued that morality cannot come from reason, rules, or commandments. Reason calculates. Rules demand obedience. Neither creates genuine moral behavior. For Schopenhauer, morality arises from compassion alone. Compassion occurs when the illusion of separation weakens. When one person recognizes the suffering of another as fundamentally the same as their own, in that moment, the will loosens its grip. Compassion does not require belief systems. It does not require optimism about humanity. It arises naturally when one understands that all individuals are manifestations of the same striving force. This led Schopenhauer to a radical conclusion. Free will, as people understand, it does not exist. Human actions flow from character, circumstance, and unconscious drives. People act as they must. In the two fundamental problems of ethics, Schopenhauer examined responsibility under this framework. If individuals are not free in their actions, how should society judge them? His answer was understanding rather than hatred. Punishment may be necessary for protection, but moral condemnation misunderstands human nature. Another crucial area of his philosophy was art. Schopenhauer believed art offers a rare escape from suffering. In aesthetic contemplation, the observer becomes detached from desire. The will temporarily falls silent. One no longer wants. One simply perceives. Among all arts, music held a unique place. Schopenhauer believed music does not represent objects or ideas. It expresses the will itself. This is why music can move people without language or concepts. It speaks directly to the deepest layer of being. As Schopenhauer grew older, his style became sharper and more accessible. This is most evident in Parerga and Paralipomena. Unlike his earlier systematic work, this book consisted of essays, aphorisms, and reflections on everyday life. Here he wrote about happiness, success, fame, solitude, aging, and human behavior. These writings reached a broader audience because they spoke directly to lived experience. Schopenhauer praised solitude. He believed those capable of thought often suffer in society because society rewards conformity, noise, and distraction. Solitude allowed one to think clearly without pressure to perform. He warned against fame. Fame depends on others' opinions, which are unstable, shallow, and temporary. To attach one's sense of worth to public approval is to surrender peace. Throughout these later writings, one theme remains constant. Life is not a problem to be solved. It is a condition to be understood. Schopenhauer did not offer salvation. He offered clarity. By the end of this phase of his life, his philosophy was fully formed. What remained was recognition. As Arthur Schopenhauer entered the final decades of his life, something within him had already settled. It was not satisfaction, and it was not happiness. It was certainty. He had spent most of his existence moving against the current of his time, resisting its optimism, its belief in progress, and its faith in reason as the guiding force of history. Now, with age, he no longer felt the need to struggle against it. He simply observed. For years, Schopenhauer had lived with minimal recognition. His major work, The World as Will and Representation, had failed to make the impact he believed it deserved. Philosophical circles were dominated by systems that promised meaning through history, spirit, or rational development. Schopenhauer rejected all of this. He believed history had no moral direction. He believed reason was not the master of human life. And he believed that suffering was not an accident to be corrected, but a fundamental feature of existence. These views made him deeply unfashionable. He was dismissed as gloomy, bitter, and irrelevant. Yet this long period of neglect shaped his later clarity. He learned to live without expectation, and in doing so, he unknowingly embodied his own philosophy. When Purga and Paralipomena was published, it was not intended to revive his reputation. Schopenhauer wrote it as a collection of supplementary thoughts, observations that did not fit neatly into his larger system. Essays on human behavior, psychology, aging, fame, honor, happiness, and solitude. What surprised him was how deeply these writings resonated. Readers recognized themselves in his words, not as ideals, but as they truly were. Tired, ambitious, disappointed, restless, anxious. He articulated the quiet dissatisfaction that follows achievement, the emptiness that appears when long-desired goals are finally reached. In these writings, Schopenhauer explained that much of human suffering does not come from great tragedy, but from misaligned expectations. People imagine life owes them fulfillment. When it fails to deliver, they experience resentment rather than understanding. Schopenhauer argued that life never promised happiness. It promised continuation. He wrote extensively about boredom, which he considered one of the clearest proofs of his philosophy. If life were inherently fulfilling, boredom would not exist. Boredom arises when desire is momentarily satisfied and nothing replaces it. It reveals the emptiness beneath constant striving. As his reputation grew, Schopenhauer became an unusual figure. He was admired, but not loved, respected, but not followed in the way fashionable philosophers were. Yet he did not seek disciples. He believed philosophy was not a movement, but a lens. His influence began to appear in unexpected places. Young thinkers who felt constrained by idealist systems found in Schopenhauer a language for inner conflict. He gave them permission to doubt progress, to question optimism, and to look inward rather than upward. Friedrich Nietzsche encountered Schopenhauer at a formative age. Nietzsche described the experience as discovering a teacher who spoke honestly about suffering without moral decoration. Though Nietzsche would later reject Schopenhauer's solution of resignation, the structure of his thinking remained shaped by him. The focus on instinct, drive, and unconscious motivation was inherited directly. Nietzsche's transformation of the will into the will to power was not a denial of Schopenhauer insight. It was an attempt to answer it differently. Where Schopenhauer sought peace through restraint, Nietzsche sought meaning through affirmation. But both began from the same diagnosis. Human life is not governed by reason. It is governed by forces beneath awareness. Sigmund Freud, decades later, would give these forces a clinical vocabulary: repression, instinct, unconscious desire. Freud did not invent the idea that humans are driven by unseen motivations. Schopenhauer had already described it philosophically. Freud acknowledged this lineage, even as he framed it within medicine and therapy. Carl Jung extended the connection further. Jung's emphasis on archetypes, symbols, and the shared psychic background of humanity mirrors Schopenhauer's belief that individuality is surface level. Beneath it lies something universal, impersonal, and ancient. Jung's collective unconscious can be read as a psychological restatement of the will. Schopenhauer's influence also reached artists, writers, and composers. His view that art suspends desire resonated deeply. For him, aesthetic contemplation was not escapism. It was temporary liberation. When one loses oneself in art, the will loosens its grip. Time fades. Desire quiets. Music occupied a unique position in this theory. Schopenhauer believed music did not represent the world like painting or literature. It expressed the inner movement of the will itself. This is why music can evoke sadness, calm, or longing without any clear object. It bypasses intellect entirely. As Schopenhauer aged, he reflected more openly on death. He did not treat it as a moral event. Death was not reward or punishment. It was simply the end of the individual manifestation of the will. The fear of death, he believed, came from attachment to individuality. Once that attachment weakens, death loses much of its terror. Old age, in this sense, was not decline. It was release. Desire weakened naturally. Ambition faded. The will, exhausted by decades of striving, loosened its hold. Schopenhauer found in this a quiet confirmation of his ideas. He did not romanticize suffering, but he refused to deny it. He believed that much psychological pain comes from resisting reality rather than understanding it. Hope, when detached from truth, becomes a source of cruelty. False optimism demands emotional energy that cannot be sustained. This is why Schopenhauer philosophy speaks so strongly to modern listeners. In a world driven by productivity, comparison, and constant stimulation, his ideas feel grounding. He does not demand improvement. He does not promise transformation. He invites understanding. For sleep, this perspective is uniquely calming. It removes urgency. It dissolves the pressure to become something more. It reframes exhaustion as natural rather than personal failure. The listener is no longer at war with themselves. Schopenhauer believed wisdom lies in knowing what not to want, in reducing unnecessary desires, in accepting limitation, in finding peace not through accumulation, but through subtraction. He did not offer happiness. He offered relief. Arthur Schopenhauer died in 1860, alone but not defeated. He had lived long enough to see his ideas survive dismissal. He understood that philosophy does not change the world quickly. It changes individuals slowly. His work remains for those who are tired of being told that life must be exciting to be meaningful. For those who feel restless without knowing why. For those who seek quiet rather than conquest. In the end, Schopenhauer did not ask the listener to love life. He asked them to see it clearly. And sometimes, clarity is the deepest form of rest.